I'm Lydia. I'm an English major, and I'm here on staff with Pollen. And I'll let our guest introduce herself here.
Hi, my name is Erin Hatton. I am an assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Buffalo.
Hello, my name is Shona Kabilas. I'm a student of psychology, and I'm here to be a part of this interview.
Hello, I'm Dolian, senior economics major.
So Dr. Hatton, you're here at Berea sharing about your work involving, I guess, the emergence of women into temporary labor force in post-war America. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Sure. So my first book is called The Temp Economy. And in this book, it's actually kind of a cultural history of temp work and the temp industry. And I look at how this industry emerged, but also how they constructed temp work as work that was for women, even though men were also doing this work at the same time. But they very strategically constructed this as women's work, essentially in order to avoid opposition to temp work at that time in the post-war era, the 1940s and the 1950s.
Can you tell me how did constructing it for women help avoid those issues?
That's a good question. Right. There were two main possible points of resistance to temp work during this time. So when they first came about, one was unions. In the post-war era, unions were at the peak of their power, and they were natural opponents of the temp industry because obviously the emergence of this new sector that was suddenly exempt from Social Security and benefits and so on, all of these elements of the social safety net that unions had just recently fought so hard to gain for their workers, unions would have fought against this sector and could have quashed it very easily. So they were natural opponents. So that was opposition number one, potential opposition number one. Potential opposition number two was that when the modern temp industry first came out in the years after World War II, most people, legislators, social activists, most people thought that these temp agencies were new iterations of a very old industry. They thought they were these private employment agents, which had largely been shut down from earlier in the century because they were notorious for their abuses of workers. So early in the 20th century, there were all these private employment agents that would connect workers to jobs. But usually these workers were maybe recently arrived immigrants or black migrants moving from the south to the north. They would supposedly get them jobs, but they would charge them exorbitant fees. They would sometimes send them to jobs that didn't really exist after taking their money. And then even sometimes they would physically abuse these workers. And so by the mid-20th century, this industry, this private employment industry, had been regulated out of existence. It was no longer really around. But when these modern temp agencies started cropping up, most people thought they were just more of the same thing. So this was potential opposition number two. So what the temp industry had to do was to convince everyone that A, they're not going to encroach on union territory, and B, they're not anything like these private employment agents. And what they did was say, oh no, don't worry, we're not encroaching on male industrial jobs, we're not hiring immigrant workers or vulnerable workers or exploitable workers. We're not even hiring real workers at all. We're just hiring housewives who have nothing better to do. And so in this way, this was a very clever, very strategic strategy because in fact not all their workers were women. Not all their workers were housewives. 40% of the workers were in fact men. And the women who were working actually did so because they needed it, they weren't just support housewives. But this is how they constructed temp work, as for women who didn't really need work, white, middle-class housewives.
And, how did they exactly construct, I guess, that image, though, if that's not the case, really?
Through a massive and very persuasive public relations campaign. So they actually wrote books. Early temp leaders wrote quite a number, 6 to 8 books in the post-war era, through magazine and newspaper articles. and through a slew of advertisements, through every kind of popular media that you can imagine. And so we see this in their verbal descriptions of who the temp workers really are, or who they're claiming they are, and also through the visual portrayal of who temps are. And without fail, they were always portrayed as these very well-coiffed, white middle-class women, often with white gloves, with earrings and hat and heels. And they're described as women who didn't really need these jobs, but wanted fulfillment and excitement.
Okay. Sounds a lot like they kind of, feminized temp work, but for people who don't know, what kind of work would these women be doing in temp work?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the occupations that would be, for women?
Mm-hmm. So in general, they were doing what we would call today pink collar work. They were going in and doing secretarial type jobs. They were stenographers, which we don't have so much today. But they were doing filing. Back then they called them Gal Fridays. So when they would show up, they would do short-term office work. And it should be noted also that temporary workers were doing other kinds of jobs as well. And like I said, there were also men doing temp jobs in industrial work as well. That wasn't part of their marketing campaign, but the women were primarily doing these secretarial jobs.
What would you say would be the implications of this kind of work? Was it empowering women while taking some of that power away? Was it a trade-off, or was it just bad?
It's actually, that's a really interesting question because it's mixed, right? So in this era where for these women, these white middle-class women for whom work was a real no-no, there was actually quite intense cultural pressure on them to stay home and not work. For those women, in fact, temp work offered them an avenue to work, a culturally accepted avenue to work. So they could perhaps go to their husbands and say, well, it's just a temporary job. It offered them a way to convince their husbands, their families, their neighbors that it wasn't a real job, if that's what they wanted. Also, I found some limited evidence that, so at that time, it was completely legal for employers to fire and or not hire women who were pregnant, as well as women who reached a certain age. So, right. And so temporary work offered women who otherwise could not find employment and who needed employment, women who were pregnant and needed jobs. They could get some temporary employment, but whereas they couldn't find regular employment. So it wasn't all bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly wasn't an oppressor of these women, not by any stretch. But as I talk about more in my book, we can also see how constructing these workers as not real workers does have broader implications later down the road, when now the temp industry is constructing all workers, or tries to convince employers to replace all of their permanent employees with temps in order to cut down on their wages and their benefits and their security. And that has broader implications for workers more generally. The fundamental argument is this, that when we carve out any group of worker as separate than and perhaps less than other workers, in this case 1950s housewives, they don't need much. They don't need real wages because they're not real workers. They don't need benefits. They have husbands who are the real breadwinners. When we carve out that group as separate and say it's okay to pay them less, it's okay to treat them as less, when we do that, that puts a wedge in, right? That opens the door to not only treat them, potentially, not necessarily, but it opens the door to treat them worse as second-class workers, but also to degrade working conditions for everyone. And it does this by, first, if more and more people if it establishes this tier of second-class work that does in fact earn lower wages, worse benefits, and worse working conditions, as temps do, on average, whether or not they're women, right? After they dropped the Kelly Growth strategy, men and women temps are now working in worse working conditions. Now, permanent employees are looking over their shoulders, worrying about losing their jobs. Are they going to bargain for higher wages as a result? Generally, no. Are they going to try to join a union when they can be replaced by temps at the drop of a hat? Absolutely not. So the prevalence, the widespread prevalence of this stratum of relatively low-paid, highly insecure workers does exert a downward pressure on working standards for everyone else. So yeah, both the idea of skill and also the idea of replaceability are very much culturally constructed. So that the notions that some workers are so skilled that they're above being replaced is a cultural construction. And we can see now, as we see more and more types of workers that we used to think were beyond reproach, that we didn't think that professors could be replaced by second-tier teachers, adjuncts, or doctors, or I don't know, there are all kinds. And we see more and more and more that professions that we thought were somehow safe are not safe. And also, I should say, both the professions that we deem as very, very highly skilled, okay, they are skilled, but skill, again, is a social construction. The jobs that we consider to be unskilled are constructed as unskilled for a reason. Right now, it's very hard for temp workers to join unions because, okay, let's say you're an employer and I am a permanent employee and I'm unionized, and you two are temps and you want to join my union. Technically, that's legal. However, in order to do so, you have to get your employer's permission and your temp agency's permission, because it's considered a multi-employer bargaining unit. So those permissions aren't normally forthcoming. So this rule effectively prevents all temps from joining permanent employees' unions, even if they work side by side for a very long time. Okay. Also, now most temps, maybe they don't work at one work site for a long period of time. Maybe they go from work site to work site to work site to work site. This also effectively prevents them from joining any kind of unions because their continued daily employment is predicated on their compliant and good and submissive behavior and not trying to organize a union. So we need to remove barriers to organizing for temps. We need to make it so that they don't have to ask permission to join a union. And then at the same time, we also need to take temps out of the anti-labor movement. So right now, the employer, if I go on strike as a permanent employee, you can call in permanent replacements. You can effectively, it's illegal to fire me, but you can permanently replace me. I know. And so you can bring in temporary workers to replace me and also make them permanent. And so temporary workers have been used as a very, very effective tool against permanent employees involved in labor disputes. So we also need to get temps out of the anti-labor movement.
Too much? I don't.
Sure, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast, and therefore you don't always get what you asked for. Typically in those situations, it doesn't usually end up that you ask too much, you get too much, and therefore they drive the company out of business. Unions are not perfect. They've been a very imperfect institution that has done amazing good for workers, but not all good. It's not, they're not a utopian solution by any stretch. In part, at first blush, we can see that women and non-whites were largely excluded from these good jobs and this heyday of good jobs that we all look back to and think it was so wonderful for this one slice of the American population. And so I agree with you. And many of the restrictions that we see, the rigidities that some unions bring can be problematic. But what that's emblematic of now is an institution that's under attack, that they're trying to hold on with whatever they got, right? And so when you don't have much power, so we see this particularly in, say, teachers' unions now, which are very much under attack. They're still there, right? They've still got some power, but they're under attack from all sides. And so they're an embattled union. Unions are declining. Union density is declined dramatically. Unions are declining all over. There's not a lot of popular support for unions. It's politically fine to destroy them. And so what can unions do? They can't gain new power. They don't have much ability to be flexible, to work with you. All they can do is hold on to what they have. And this increases their inflexibility. But it's in large part, because they're under attack. When we see instances when unions have power, but also have an employer that's willing to work with them, that actually can generate some really interesting and creative win-win solutions for both employers and workers. But for many other people who need employment, it's not, so it can be a mid-range of jobs. Obviously those people need employment, so it's,
right.
They need employment.
Right.
But it can be anything from secretarial to accountants. There are temp agencies for lawyers, nurses. There are actually several temp agencies that are dedicated for nurses as strike breakers. So you can travel across the country and break strikes as a nurse when nurses go on strike. So there are lots of actually very skilled white-collar positions and temp agencies dedicated to those jobs. So whereas in the early years we did see, because of the employment restrictions for women, we saw them able to transgress those restrictions through these temp agencies. Thankfully, we don't have those same restrictions. So it's not this avenue to bypass discrimination in that way. But it's not a way to get into permanent employment for most workers. For some workers, yes, but not most workers.
So we've talked a lot about kind of what it does to, I guess, like groups of people, but what is it doing to the actual like economic market? This kind of like, I guess, what is temp work becoming so prevalent doing to the actual like economy, if that makes sense? What is it doing to the market itself?
In terms of the labor market?
I guess, yeah, sure.
So, so I would say that it's pulling down wages. It's exerting downward pressure on the wages for other workers. Is it making productivity go down? I don't know. No one's really found that. You might believe that temps are going to do a worse job, and there's some debate. People have looked into it, and I don't know. In point of fact, a lot of temps are working really hard to try to get that permanent job. On the flip side, studies do show that permanent employees that are treated well tend to do a really good job. But the permanent employees that are treated as disposable may not perform much better than them. So, I don't know. It depends what you're comparing to what you're comparing. But in terms of productivity and so on, you're getting decent workers because people are hungry for work. They want to do a good job. They're working well. But they're not getting paid the same, and they're not getting the same benefits, which is huge. And that's pulling down wage standards for everybody.
On that note, so it sounds like the temp sector has grown a lot in terms of who is involved with it, moving from women to include lots of different levels of work and skill. how have the temp sector, has it grown in terms of movements? Who should we expect to be fighting for improvements in the temp sector, or is it in a situation for many workers that they really can't, they're afraid to do that kind of movement?
It is extremely challenging for temp workers to challenge their worker conditions. That is true, but some workers have, and with a critical mass, anything is possible.
Right.
And unions have finally and very slowly begun to turn their attention to temp worker issues, but again, it's very hard. I mean, organizing regular workers is extremely difficult, but organizing temps who are dispersed throughout work sites or who are terrified of being, they're not officially fired, just not being called back the next day,
Right.
is very difficult. So the organizing issues are huge. The barriers are massive. But organizing has happened. There's a good story in the mid-1990s. All of the sanitation workers in, I think it was St. Louis, but don't quote me on that. All of the sanitation workers in a city in the South were temps, and they decided to go on strike. And so one day, in the middle of the summer in the South, they stopped collecting trash. And the trash piled up real quick. And this was working with SEIU, this was working with a union. And they got their demands met. Now, is it going to turn out that way always? No, because temps can really easily be let go. But it can happen, and so, we do need to think of other models for, if not traditional union organizing, but organizing temps and improving working conditions for temps. So a lot of those temp agencies kind of at the bottom of the markets, they're oftentimes fly-by-night agencies. They'll put up a sign outside a door. They don't have much more than a phone. And they'll send, oftentimes, largely all immigrants, oftentimes undocumented immigrants, but they don't know, they don't check papers, to construction jobs or other jobs around the city. This is huge and it's important. And, okay, I'm sorry, what did you ask? How are they?
Are they changing the atmosphere of the temporary workers, the working condition?
So it's making it worse. I mean, when you have, this is an already vulnerable segment of the labor markets. When you have an extremely vulnerable population moving in to an already vulnerable segment of the labor market, the exploitation just compounds. So now we see workers who are sent to jobs, they aren't told what they're going to do for the day. They're not given proper equipment to do it when they get there. Or maybe they're told that they're going to do something, but when they get there, they're told to do something else. They don't know how to work the bulldozer, but they don't want to not do it because if they don't, they won't be called the next day and their livelihood depends on it. So they do it, but they don't know how to work it. Maybe they hurt themselves. Maybe they hurt someone else. They're put in extremely dangerous situations. Sometimes they're asked to pull down hazardous material. They're not given face masks. It's horrendous. And yet, they feel like they must do it. I was earlier today talking about coercive labor. This is a coercive labor condition where they feel like they cannot say no because their day-to-day employment essentially requires that they comply with any request that's given to them.
Now that we've talked about kind of your existing work, why don't you tell us about your next project? What are you working on next?
Sure. So right now I'm working on a book project in which I look at, well, I'm not exactly sure, it's in formation. I'm looking at 2 to 3 different groups of workers. Originally I've designed this project to look at 3 different groups of workers who are differentially not covered by labor and employment laws. So on the extreme end of not protected are prisoners. Prisoners who work while they're incarcerated. They're not considered workers by any labor and employment law except for they can't be discriminated against. In the middle range are workfare workers. These are welfare recipients who have to work for their public assistance. They're supposed to get minimum wage if you combine all of their cash and non-cash benefits together. But they don't get workers' comp, they can't unionize, they can't do all, they're not workers by most laws. Okay, that's my middling group. And then there are domestic workers, people who, house cleaners, nannies, elder caretakers, people who work in other people's homes. Domestic workers, along with farm workers, were originally excluded from all labor and employment laws in the 1930s. They didn't get minimum wage, they didn't get overtime, they didn't get to unionize, and everything. Little by little by little over the years, they have gained protections. Now in 2010, in New York State for the first time, they gained full protections, except for the right to unionize. So, these are my three groups. I've been doing interviews with all three of these groups. I've done over 100 interviews with workers. And so my book is shifting in a way that I think I'm focusing on coerced labor. And so will actually probably look mostly in the book on the prisoners and the workfare workers. Because the domestic workers are really quite different in terms of the coercion that they experience at work. And so I'm looking at the conditions of their work, the problems that they confront, and then also how they deal with those problems on the job.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about your middle group? Because I think that's one area that I feel like with the mass incarceration problem, we hear a little bit more about prison, but we don't hear a lot about what actually, like, as far as coerced labor with the welfare recipients. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like, how are they coerced? How does that all play out?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
So for many people who are considered able-bodied, with welfare reform, if you want to get benefits, you need to work. It varies a little bit state by state. My research is based in New York State. You got to show up, you got to do work. And so for the folks that I'm interviewing, they go to a work site, they may be sent out. Typically, they can't work for for-profit companies. So they'll work for nonprofit agencies, or they'll go to the parks and pick up trash or weed the gardens. Generally, it's busy work rather than skills building and real work experience. So it's always framed as work experience. Here's an interesting tidbit. In New York City, they have workfare workers cleaning the subway trains. But interestingly, the workfare workers who do clean the subway cars there wear these little placards, these labels that say interns on them. They label them interns, which is really interesting and fascinating twist. And this is one of my arguments in this new book, how all these groups of workers who are excluded from our legal and cultural our laws and our cultural consciousness of them as workers, how those boundaries are fluid and also cross over between.
With labeling them interns, does that kind of obscure, I guess, the problem that they're not?
That's absolutely right. It's trying to reify their exclusion from protections. So these aren't real workers. They're volunteering their time. They're more like interns. But they're not allowed to quit their jobs. If they do, they'll lose their benefits. If they have problems at the work site, they suck it up or they lose their benefits. So the coercion for these workers is very real.
How maybe forced labor plays into the mass incarceration problem that we can kind of, like, I don't know, that's been a big debate on campus in particular.
So the issue of mass incarceration is major. And it's gotten a lot of attention, and much deserved attention. Less attention has been given to the fact that all of these prisoners that are incarcerated are performing labor for those institutions. And the types of labor that they perform vary across states and across prisons. So it depends on whether they're working in a state prison or a federal prison and or a private prison. And typically in private prisons, they're performing labor for private companies. And though in that case, I think they typically make minimum wage. But the prisoners that I interviewed, they're typically working in state prisons. They make between 15 and 25 cents an hour. These folks keep the prison running. They do everything. They do all the electrical work, all the plumbing, all the painting, all the cleaning, all the kitchen work. They do it all the lawns and grounds work. And some of them didn't have any problems at work, and many of them didn't necessarily mind their work. Sometimes, and even often, they found it was good to keep busy. It's kind of boring. But when you don't have a choice but to work, when you're treated horribly on the job, or in general, and you have no recourse, when you're beaten up, when the option is, to do as they say, to clean up the pile of poo, or to be sent to isolation, that's coercion. In the temp sector, there is actually quite a divergence and a bifurcation in the temp market. And so there's a lot of agencies that are really at the bottom of the market, and think here like day labor agencies that are in the construction industry, and these are hard and dangerous and overall pretty bad jobs. And these agencies mostly employ men, mostly immigrants, in part because they locate in immigrant neighborhoods rather than, say, African American neighborhoods. Okay, so there's a bulge of temp agencies at the bottom, and then there's a kind of middle and top sector of temp work. And this is in your pink and white collar work. Does temp work offer an avenue up? Generally, no. At best, overall, temp work leads to more temp work. Do young people occasionally find an entree into the labor market through temp work? Yes. Yes, they do. In part because oftentimes employers are no longer hiring off the street. They may only hire through temp jobs.